Hello, everyone. So, I have been talking about racial or ethnic groups in Big Brother USA for quite a bit now. I made a video on Black women, Black men, Italian men, and even Asian house guests, and how I had to divide Asian house guests into four categories based off location. Today, I'm going to be talking about the Latin house guests and some of their journeys in the Big Brother USA house. What's interesting about this is that since Latin isn't a race, there are a wide range of people in this group. There are white Latinos, black Latinos, Asian Latinos, mixed race Latinos, so on and so forth. But it seems like Big Brother in general likes to treat them as a separate racial group. So that's kind of interesting there. Some of them I couldn't really find much information on pertaining their ethnicity playing a part in their journey compared to others who had it play a part in their journeys. I don't know if it's because some of them kind of blend in with the White House guests more, or there just really isn't anything else to discuss. So let's just get right to it. So the first Latin house guest to be on Big Brother US, if I'm correct, is Robert from Big Brother 4. So I immediately remember production playing up his Cuban heritage a lot in his intro package, in his diary rooms, so on and so forth. And they like to associate that with him being a playboy throughout his life, and they mention it several times throughout the season. So the main moments that I have to discuss is in the final three, and there's a lot of tension between himself and the other woman through the last several weeks now. A part of this is due to some of the misogynistic comments he made about them. So there is a live feed transcript and report from that time where June and Allison would continuously insult him as well as his daughter while mentioning his Cuban heritage several times as an insult. June herself has stated that she regrets this repeatedly, but the fact that they had to bring up his ethnicity is whack, and the fact that they used that as an insult despite all the other material that they had was problematic. In general, it seemed like production boxed him into the sassy slash spicy slash flirty Latino role throughout the season. But because they felt so comfortable mentioning his Cuban heritage in the final three, I'm pretty sure there are other instances throughout the season where this happened, but the archives have just been lost for it. And remember, this was after weeks of him winning America's favorite prizes and votes over and over and over again. So it did seem like they're kind of just jealous. So the next person on the list is Ivette from Big Brother 6, and I have quite a lot to say about her actually. So throughout the season, she would use the excuse for her being Latin as a rationale for her anger issues and her loud personality. So in general, she just kind of stereotype herself and her people with the negative tropes that have been associated with Latin people. So there are feed transcripts back in the day that had people like Janelle and Kaser continuously call herself ghetto and make borderline comments that refer to her skin color and racial groups at times. Even in an episode, Janelle would call Yvette ghetto based off of the slide she made, and there are a few other weird comments like that. In this season, there was no black woman house guest, and because Yvette is darker skinned, it seemed like a lot of the tropes that would be associated with a black woman in Big Brother was placed onto Yvette in this specific season, and I don't think she helped herself in this matter. And production definitely played it up for sure. So Yvette would be obnoxious in order to make her allies laugh and mentioned being Latin over and over and over again. No one should mention their race, ethnicity, or nationality like it's a personality trait. It was very immature overall. She was such a ride or die person throughout the season for her team and volunteered herself to go on the block and was the main person pushing for them to stay together, but they were never really as loyal to her as she thought. April and Jennifer did try voting her out over Sarah in week 5, and then she realized that April was over her in the final four, causing a fight as April started to blame her actions on Ivette and her influence. Even after the season, Ivette was told about all the comments that the friendship made about her, and all of it was them making fun of her, and some of them already made comments about them not wanting to go to quote-unquote underprivileged areas that involved racial minorities, and she cut all of them off but Bo, and that's still the case today. There is a term called tap dancing, where minorities like to please their majority white allies by acting stereotypically to make them feel comfortable with them and to laugh with them. But Yvette didn't realize until it was too late that they were laughing at her. And of course, she made racist comments as well to Kaysar specifically, but I do think her ethnicity and her skin color definitely played a part into how she was treated and perceived in the house and in production. But of course, like I said earlier, she did herself absolutely no favors. So, from the same season is Jennifer from Big Brother 6. Like Yvette, she was considered to be ghetto and obnoxious by some people in the house, especially the Sovs, and there were some alleged colorist comments that were made about her on the live feeds as well. Like I mentioned with Yvette, there was no black woman on the season, so some of the treatment that would have went to black women almost immediately went to Jennifer as well as Yvette, but in general there isn't a whole lot to talk about with her. So the next person on the list is Carol from Big Brother 8, and in general there's just nothing notable to discuss about her. She was a first boot, which is something that you might say that because there was only a black person on the season, it made her, a Latina, stand out more and easier to get rid of. But in general, she's just a forgettable first boot. Nothing to discuss here. So we're going to skip a few seasons and talk about Lydia from Big Brother 11. So there was the whole situation where Lydia was on the block and she said what she had to say and did what she had to do to save herself, and being vetoed. This was at the expense of Brendon, and he was mad at her about it. So he calls her a bunch of awful names. Because Kevin was there, he decides to call Kevin a Mexican slur, which she of course doesn't take well since she's a Latin person who is proud of her heritage. She tells Brendon to kiss her Latin ass. He doesn't care about his racist comment, and she is mad that many of the other house guests aren't as mad about the situation as she thinks they should be. The argument ends up going inside where she's arguing with Jeff and Jordan about it, since she, as a minority, felt attacked and she didn't like how race was brought into it. What made it even worse was that those same people started campaigning for Brendon to stay, and all of this just made her gravitate towards the Jesse side of the house, which had most of the racial minorities on it. So, like I've mentioned in the past, there was a racial divide that formed in the Big Brother 11 house, and she sided with most of the minorities. Throughout the season, she was portrayed as extremely emotional and extremely angry and extremely fiery, the typical archetypes that are placed on Latin house guests, especially Latin women. And of course, there was her meltdown at her final week, which, in my opinion, was kind of rational, but she was portrayed horribly throughout it. She fit into the quote-unquote spicy Latina category. And I know Kevin talked about how triggered he was by the events in the season, and I'm pretty sure a lot of that trauma from earlier on in the game just culminated in her final week, especially with the coup d'etat and Chima's expulsion. So I'm pretty sure she felt some of those undertones as well. So we are going to move on to Natalie from the exact same season. I know there was a low-key racial divide within the house from the very beginning, and obviously she was on the side of the house that had more of the people of color in it. I don't think there was a specific event regarding her ethnicity or race in this season that I could bring up that happened to Natalie specifically. Of course, there was the coup situation that was put there to help Jeff and his side of the house, the Caucasian side, and took away the power that she and her alliance essentially earned for the rest of the season, but nothing directly came from her. Of course, she had to watch Chima and Lydia's meltdown due to all the events that happened, and I wouldn't be shocked if she felt some of the racial elements that took place in the season. At the same time, she made a lot of social errors throughout the season, but she would end up going to the end with Jordan, who was a lot less strategically involved in the season. But due to partially America's perception and Natalie's not good social game, she ended up losing. Some people could say that there was a racial element to it since Natalie earned her power and she essentially had to scrape by for the second half of the season, while Jordan had everything so easy. So we're going to move on a season and talk about Brendon from Big Brother 12 and Big Brother 13. While he is half Anglo and half Mexican, meaning that he's a white Latino, he was in an extremely Caucasian cast, and the only other person that wasn't identifying as Caucasian was Monet, who is biracial with white, but who also left very early in the season. I always found it interesting that Brittany would call him Homo sapien and a Neanderthal, and I wondered if she would have called another man who was more identifyingly Caucasian that. I don't even remember her calling Frank or Boogie names like that in the season. Of course, Brendon's behavior wasn't great at times throughout the season, but I do think the house guests, as well as production, made him look like the most aggressive person there was. I also kind of remember himself and Rachel talking about how they are treated by the fan base as well as the people in the Big Brother 13 house compared to Jeff and Jordan, and how they are always villainized, they are hated, while Jeff and Jordan were loved. If you really break it down, it is interesting because both couples definitely had toxic elements to them. Both couples had several arguments throughout the season, but Jeff and Jordan were always portrayed positively, while Brendon and Rachel were portrayed negatively. Could this partially be due to him having Latino heritage and making him and Rachel the quote-unquote spicier, quote-unquote the most problematic couple compared to Jeff and Jordan, who are easier to paint as saints? Maybe. It also doesn't help that his last name, Viegas, is a Latin last name, where maybe if he had a Caucasian last name, things would have been easier. It would have been easier for him to maybe blend in with the majority Caucasian cast. I don't know, but it's an interesting element to look into. So the next person is Jenn from Big Brother 14, and there really isn't anything to discuss, despite her being an endgamer and making it fifth. I think she was cast to be a spicy Latina and to have this big, boisterous personality, but when she was in the house, she was just very chill and relaxed. And I think due to that, she was extremely under-edited. So I guess her race or ethnicity could play a part in how she was edited in the season. So we're going to move on to Brittany from Big Brother 16. Clearly, she was cast to be the sexy Latina woman, and that was her role that production wanted her to fill. I just remember Nicole and Christine hating on Brittany really, really, really hard, and she never did anything to either woman. They also essentially hated on Amber and Victoria, the two other women who don't identify as Caucasian, as well. So there was clearly a pattern with the two of them and how they treated some of the women of color in the season. Okay, so the next person to discuss is Jozea, and I discussed him in another video. There really isn't a whole lot to discuss since he was booted week 1, but clearly he felt closer with the minorities in the house, whether they were black or whether they were Latin, since he was able to speak Spanish with some of them. He wanted to start a POC alliance, but of course he was sold out, and I think that added an extra sting to him. But he clearly was also cast to be this big, boisterous, obnoxious, black and Latino person. So from the same season, we have Natalie. I feel like production kind of pushed her into this sexy Latina role, just from her dress code and promo shoots, to how she was introduced to us, and how she would come off in her diary rooms, which were extremely fake. Everyone would definitely slut shame her at various points in the house, and production definitely played it up. I would not be shocked if her ethnicity gave some of the house guests as well as production an extra push to go with the slut-shaming narrative that happened several times throughout the season, since she was clearly cast to be the sexy Latina, and as the season went on, she was portrayed as manipulating James, even if that wasn't necessarily the full story or even part of the story. So the next person we're going to discuss is Victor, who is from the same season as well. I mentioned the spicy Latina role with Natalie, but it was very clear that they played into that a lot more with Victor, and he played into it as well. He has since stated after the season that he created this stereotypically Latin persona to get cast on the show, since he didn't get cast on Big Brother 16 when he was his normal self. He would say these ridiculous Latin phrases, consistently mention El Fit Victor, and would tie everything to his ethnicity in the diary room. So it kind of says a lot that he felt like he needed to essentially sell himself and his people out to get cast and to be a stereotypical Latin man. So he used all of this for clout, and once he made his transition, once he got with Nicole and since gotten married and had a child together, people mentioned that Nicole, quote unquote, changed Victor, and I think that's problematic on many levels, but I don't think that Victor changed. I think the Victor now is the Victor who was always there, and there are even pictures of him in his early 20s looking like how he looks like now, but it just shows that he felt the need to change his persona to get cast and used racial/ethnic lines to do so. So Ramses from Big Brother 19 is next on the list. I've already discussed him in another video. I already addressed the Dominican situation in that other video and how he chooses to identify himself, which a lot of Dominican people tend to do, even if they are black or they have black ancestry or indigenous ancestry. They identify with their nationality, like that is anything but a nationality, and how that involves race or ethnicity when it just doesn't. From the same season is Jessica, and honestly, her poor treatment in the house had nothing to do with her ethnicity whatsoever, and I think it's because she was mixed with being a white Latina and Italian, and she wasn't in a very Caucasian cast, like some of the others who fit that category. I do think she was cast to be the quote-unquote sexy Latina person, like several others before her. So the next person I'm going to discuss is Josh from Big Brother 19. And it was clear that production cast him to be the loud, boisterous, obnoxious Latino person. He reminds me a lot of Ivette, actually, where they both had very loud, obnoxious personalities and didn't realize that the house, mainly their allies, were laughing at them instead of with them. He was on the outs at first because most of the house found him to be annoying, but because he hated Cody and Jessica, who became house targets, and most of the house was very passive at the time, they, mainly Paul, would goad him into attacking the people on the outs, and this happened long after Cody and Jessica were evicted, as he would do this with Mark and Elena, and then eventually Kevin. Fortunately for him, the quote-unquote tap dancing gave him the win, despite him being put in many positions where it could have gotten very physical and very bad for him. Production also definitely played a part into this and how they portrayed his loud, obnoxious personality as well as his emotional personality, where he would often cry after starting confrontations and getting handled or read by other people. So they clearly used his emotional side as well. So the next person we are going to discuss is JC from Big Brother 20. I don't recall anything pertaining his ethnicity taking part in his experience in the Big Brother house. I remember that there's an awkward conversation with him and Bailey about him using the N-word and her using the midget word, but that's just it. And of course, he said several controversial and borderline racist things outside of the season, but he feels justified in doing so because he's claiming to be a minority, though he's very clearly a white person who just happens to be Latin. So there's always that dichotomy where white people who are Latin feel like they can say a bunch of slurs about other people because they are seen as a POC. It's a lot to deal with. So we're going to move on a season and talk about Annalise from Big Brother 21, and honestly, there really isn't much of anything to discuss. While she was a person of color, she's also borderline white passing, or white passing to some people, and she's also attractive. So she played into that sexy Latina casting trope that production likes to use. And I think because of this, she was able to blend in with the White House guests in ways that Kemi, Ovi, Isabella, David, and even Jessica from this season couldn't blend in. So we're going on to Jessica from the same season in Big Brother 21, and there really isn't much to talk about with her and how her ethnicity played a part in the season. It is interesting that compared to Annalise, who is also a Latina, Jessica was put on the outs for essentially the entire season. This could be because she isn't as white passing, she isn't seen as conventionally attractive, despite her being a model and her being older. But there is that difference that had them in different positions for most of the season. But in general, I don't think there's a specific incident where her ethnicity came into play in the season. So the next person chronologically is Alyssa from Big Brother 23. So she was left out of the cookout despite being a person of color because that alliance was for black representation and not person of color representation. And she wasn't black, clearly. As her journey in the Big Brother house was starting to get its endpoint, she would play up her ethnicity as some sort of a joke, as there were less and less white people in the house in the jury portion of the season, and mostly everyone else was black. She did take it personally after a while, as we saw in CBS The Challenge, because she felt like she was hoodwinked, and I'm sure that her ethnicity being a part of the reason why she wasn't included and essentially excluded annoyed and hurt her as well. So from the same season in Big Brother 23 is Kyland. There was not much discussion about his Latin heritage on the show, but it did seem like at times he did overcompensate at times to be seen as black or more black, and he was the most vocal about who's the quote-unquote best black representative of the cookout. Like Hannah, and like I discussed with her on the Asian video, I wonder if there were 6 Latin house guests and only 2 black house guests, would he have joined the Latin Alliance or whatever? The dilemma probably forced him to embrace his black heritage more than his Latin heritage on the show, especially with the casting imbalance. So I wonder how he felt about that. Or having to exclude Alyssa because she wasn't black, even though he and her have similar Latin heritage. So we are moving on to the current season of Big Brother, which is Big Brother 24. And they infiltrated more Latin house guests, though you wouldn't immediately know it. So the first person we are discussing is Paloma. She was only in the house for a week, but everyone in the house believed she was a sweet, dainty, innocent person, despite her personality being the exact opposite. And because Taylor, a black woman, quote-unquote, messed with Paloma, the entire house started believing her and everything she said, even if she was blatantly lying. This was clearly done because she's a white Latina woman, and because she is attractive, she is white, and because she was the youngest person in the house, she had this innocence that was put on her that was unfounded, and it warped the house guests' perception of her. So chronologically, the next person is Nicole, and like the last video, there really isn't much to discuss about her since I don't recall her ethnicity playing much of a role in her journey in the Big Brother house. But I did find it interesting that certain people in the leftovers didn't find it worthy to save her, but they would find it worthy to save other white or white passing house guests that were on the other side of the house. So Daniel is next, and most people don't even know that he's half Latin, so he's a white Latino person, and he's a white passing Latino person. And I think because he was white passing, it felt like people like Kyle felt more comfortable with him and felt like he deserved to stay and was going to use him to go against the POC in the house, especially the ones that were Kyle's own allies. Daniel ate up everything Paloma was saying, even if she was lying, especially pertaining to Taylor, because he felt that similarity in their white privilege and being white passing. The main person I wanted to discuss from this season is Indy. So there's shockingly a lot to discuss with Indy, despite her arguably being the most under-edited person on the season. So Indy mentioned that she wanted to be on Big Brother Brazil, and that Big Brother US would be akin to that and would be a good starting point for her to get there. Most of the house guests did not care for her initially because of this, and found her speaking hard to understand. There's definitely a few people who made judgments on her because she was a Brazilian woman who migrated to the US a decade ago, and there are definitely some xenophobic undertones, especially with how she was treated in the house by many people. And of course, we have to talk about the big one, where she was grouped in with the Black and Arab house guests in being part of a cookout alliance by Cal, and some of the other white house guests were agreeing with this. This is problematic in so many ways, but Indy is a white Latina, so she is a white woman. But because she was not from Europe, or because she is not WASP, it put her lower on the hierarchy as the more quote-unquote whiter white house guests pushed her down. It just shows that in society, there's a hierarchy even amongst white people. But because she is not European, she was placed low on the totem pole. What makes this even worse is that she didn't even get along with some of the people in the supposed cookout alliance. She didn't get along with Taylor. She didn't have a great relationship with Monte. She wasn't really close to Terrence, so on and so forth. Of course, when this news was brought to her in the jury house, she of course didn't take it well because it was just very stupid. And the final person that I'm going to discuss in the video is Monte, though I discussed him at depth in another video. He would always bring up his Latino heritage and made it seem like he was biracial, though there are such things as Afro-Latinos. I'm going to refer you to the other video where I discussed him more at length. Going through the list of Latin house guests is sure something. Because they are the second most cast minority group in Big Brother US, production clearly had more experience with them and more expectation with how they wanted their Latin house guests to be portrayed, essentially. And a lot of them were cast either to be sexy or good looking, or cast due to their supposed explosive personalities. What was interesting going through this list is that some of them had essentially no bad experiences, while others had horrible experiences. Some of this would be based off of whether they are on a predominantly white cast, so even if they are a white Latino, they would still be treated poorly and would be at the bottom of the totem pole because they are in such an Anglo-white cast. And some white Latinos could easily fit in with the white house guests and had no problem. Because production and some of these house guests liked using their Latin heritage to be their personality trait, a lot of house guests would use that against them whenever they felt like it was convenient to do so. So there was that problem as well. They have started casting more Black Latinos or Afro Latinos within recent years. So that is a huge positive, since for most of the journey of Big Brother, they tended to cast more white Latinos, and that would kind of balance things out in a weird way because some of the white Latinos identified as white instead of with their Latino heritage. And with the Afro-Latino house guests, I noticed that they tended to either be forced to choose one side over the other, as we've seen with a few of them, so there is that dilemma there. They don't really cast many, if any, indigenous Latinos, and I think that's a problem and it's something that Big Brother needs to work on, especially if they're serious about this new BIPOC casting implementation that's been put in place throughout the last 2 seasons. Overall, I've enjoyed looking into the racial categories of Big Brother US and how they handle the house guests within these racial groups, and it really says a lot. about the problematic elements that is taking place throughout the show, and it shows how casting sees people in these racial groups, as well as the network, so CBS as well, since they make the final decision on casting. I'm thinking about doing something similar to Big Brother Canada, and how that will go will be interesting because it's a smaller sample size, but I'm glad I did this, and thank you all for watching and supporting, and I'll be back with something soon.